Hello everyone, welcome to the St. Joseph Philosophy course. Today is week 2, and today we'll be discussing change. Now if you remember last week, we looked over the different types of philosophy. The highest was metaphysics, and right below that was called physics. Today we're going to be studying physics. The object of our study is going to be primarily change, and we're going to focus on the concepts of what's called act and potency. So what is change? Remember, we're going over physics, so we're not going over physics in terms of secular physics, but we're going to be going over philosophical physics. What is change, and how can things change? Well, this is answered ultimately by the concepts of act, or a thing that actually is, and potency, something that potentially is. Now, to understand this question, we must go back to the early philosophers. There were 2 early philosophers. These are before the times of Plato and Aristotle, and they were contemplating change and how to explain it. One was by the name of Parmenides. He looked around the world and he saw change, but he claimed change wasn't real, it was only apparent. His philosophical system believed that there are only 2 categories of being and non-being. Now, if being and non-being are the only types of things that exist, then what is simply is. What isn't simply can't be. What is already has that which is, and what isn't never can come into being. There's no principle of change. One of the philosophical principles is that something cannot give what it does not have. Now, if something has a certain type of being, it will already manifest this type of being. What is needed for change is for something to give something to something else. However, since all there is being and non-being in the view of Parmenides, this is not possible. The other philosopher is named Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus had more of a common sense approach to this view. He looked around the world and he saw change is obviously occurring. Actually, he said, everything changes. We look at the river constantly changing. Man starts out as a child but grows into an adult, and eventually he dies. All sorts of things. The clouds change, it rains, it's sunny one day, the earth, the planets, even things that are motionless, the earth, the ground. At one moment it's hot. Another moment it's cold. Everything is changing in some way. And this is why Heraclitus claimed that there is nothing but change. There is no principle of stasis. Now, how do we answer this question? Well, we go to Aristotle, who was a great philosopher who came up with a solution to this problem. His answer is that both Heraclitus and Parmenides, in some sense, are right. And in another sense, they are wrong. Heraclitus is correct insofar as change does exist. And Parmenides is correct insofar as if all we have is being and non-being, then there cannot be change. Aristotle fixes this problem by his acknowledging the existence of what's called potency. Now, what is potency? Potency is a type of being that exists between being and non-being. Potency is the capacity to receive a different type of being. An example we can give is a tuba player. I think this is a very good example. Now, let's say I'm trying to play some sort of song on a tuba, right? Now, insofar as I'm a man, I have what's called first potency. Now, first potency is the capacity to perform some sort of action. So, all human beings have the capacity to learn and acquire a skill and then play music on a tuba. However, not all people have the skill or knowledge. Now, there are people called musicians. A musician has both the skill and the knowledge to play a song. Now, a musician is in what's called second potency. Now, second potency means that you have a first potency, right? You have that capacity, but you also have some sort of act. You physically have a skill. Yet it is potency insofar as one is capable of physically playing a musical piece because they obtained this skill or second potency. Next, there's what's called first act, also referred to as first actuality. Now, it's the same as second potency, but its focus is on something different. Second potency is focused on the idea that you are still in potency to be able to perform the piece of music. However, first actuality is actuality because you actually have this skill. Next, there's what's called second act. Now, second act is the actual action by which one plays a musical piece. So, all human beings have first potency insofar as they are capable of learning to play music. Only musicians have second and first actuality, and by a musician, we mean anyone who has the skill and ability to play these pieces. And then these musicians are only in second act when they are actually playing the piece. Alright, so we have a basic understanding of this idea of potency. Now, we must understand that potency doesn't just mean to have the ability. Potency is a true increase in being. Something that has potency has more being than something that is similar but does not also have that same potency. So to understand this more clearly, I'm going to use an analogy from a video game I used to play. Now, the virtual world of computers can really help us understand certain metaphysical principles because we can pick apart and create reality. However, even in a 3D world of a video game, we are still subject to the laws that govern the 3D universe. So, let's say in a video game, you have your map, the place you're at. Now this can be a 3D map with 3D objects. Now, when you go to create this 3D map, you'll be creating all sorts of different shapes and things. Now, you're not actually creating things in the true sense. You're creating, something with a shape of a tree. You're applying certain colors to it, and it looks like a tree, or a house, or a car, or many different things. These objects don't have their true individual existence. Now, In the game I used to play, Lego Island, it was similar to that. It was a very primitive game, so it was a very basic map. However, things could not move, or many things could not move. It was very primitive. So let's say you have a game and you just have a map. You haven't done any more code, you just drawn the map. You now have the world of Parmenides. All there is being and non-being. In order to have motion and change in your map, you have to apply potency. Now, how is this done? Well, let's give a little example first. In the real world, if I take a rock or some object and I throw it at another material object with enough speed and enough power, something is going to break. Why? Because material objects in the real world have potencies to change, to break. Now let's say I go to the same map in a virtual world in a computer, and I program a rock, and I throw it at objects in my map that I created. I can digitally enhance the speed of this object, but doing that is not going to cause it to destroy other things. The reason is because those objects in the program don't have a potency or a capacity to change. They simply are, and they have no capacity to change their being. All right, let's look a little more closely at this idea of change. So in my game Lego Island, though it was very basic, most things couldn't change because it was an early game, but there were a few things that could change. So there were some Legos that you walked up to and you could hit and nothing happened. But there were other ones that if you would hit them, they would change color. Now, why is one Lego able to change and another one not? It's because one had potency. Now, to understand this, let's kind of look at the code. Now, this is not exactly how code is written, but it's enough to understand the principles. Let's say I have an object, right? My Lego. We'll call this object 1. Okay, let's say we're coding the object. We add a height. I'll make the height 1. And we add a width. I'll make the width 1. Now we add a depth. Remember, it's a 3D object. And we'll also make that 1. Now we'll also add a color. And we'll make this one black. So these are the attributes I have for my object. Now my computer is going to make my object so the height is, the height is 1. The width is 1. So height and width. And the depth is also 1. So I more or less have a cube. Actually, I have a perfect cube. Alright. And the color of this is black. Now this, object 1, is going to remain black. Alright. Now let's do object 2. This is going to be a similar thing, except this object is going to have potency. It's going to be able to change. Now the code of object 2 is going to look very similar to the code of object 1, except it's going to have an addition. If hit, change to red. If red and hit, change to green. Then repeat, loop. So what is that happening? So I am telling object 2 that if it is hit, that blackness goes away and it receives the form or the color red. Then if red and it's hit, it loses that redness and receives the color green. This is what you call potency, for it is the capacity of this second object to change. Now, as we can see, that though externally these objects may look exactly the same, intrinsically these objects are very different. We can also see that this potency is an increase in being, because there is more being in object 2 than there is in object 1. Object 2 is capable of certain things that object 1 is not. So that's one example of potency. Let's go to another. So in this same game, there was this cave. And by this cave, there was a little piece of grass. And I was a kid when I played this, so I was always fascinated by the fact that for some reason I could go to this piece of grass, I could jump on it, and you know what? It wasn't going to change. It wasn't going to change. The piece of grass was not going to bend. Now, why did that piece of grass bend? Because it didn't have potency. Now, let's kind of look at the code of the piece of grass. Let's say the height, say it's 3, and the width, let's say it's 0.2, because it's very thin, and depth, we'll say it's also 0.2. It's very small. As a kid looking at this, I couldn't understand why jumping on this thing, why it would not budge. And the color was green. Now, let's say there are many, even though this particular object is not capable of change. Nowadays, there are many modern and advanced games and simulations where they show material objects and they very realistically imitate their movements and their ability to change and break. Now, how do they do that? That is done through adding potency to the object. Alright, so at the height of 1.5 or above, change the angle. So this little dot is going to be halfway, and what we want is for this angle between this and this to change so that instead of being like this, it's like this. So in order to do that, that means that the angle of the object will be 0, as it is right now, but as this object continues to curve down, this number right here will change between 0 to 180 degrees. Now, this ability for this number right here to change is potency. Unlike the angles of other objects, this is set and standard in all the other parts of the map. This angle is in stasis. It contains no potency. Now, this angle for this object, this piece of grass we've created, It's always an act to one particular degree. However, it has the potency to change to any of those degrees between 0 and 180. Alright, so that's one explanation of potency. You can see how this potency actually causes a change in the type of being. Now, for more advanced simulations, to more perfectly simulate the grass moving and bending and changing, you would need to apply more potencies to the code. Now, an example of this is AutoCAD. For anyone who is familiar with the program AutoCAD, it is a software that engineers can use to take certain material objects and test their forces for the sake of experimentation. This can be done on things like bridges or on smaller things like an iPhone, and using computer models to stress test the objects before they're actually assembled. Now, how is it done? It's done through applying potencies. So let's say you have an iPhone case that you're trying to test. First, you have to draw the physical dimensions of the iPhone case. Now, just like the map, the physical shape and colors is not enough to demonstrate how this iPhone frame or case will adapt to the real world, to certain stresses. What you need to do is find the properties of the materials you are going to use and apply the potencies, the mathematical potencies of those materials into the design you have. These potencies and in that object allow it to behave and act just like the real material objects would. However, only by adding those potencies, those forces, those capacities to change the object, can you run the simulation. Alright, so we have a basic understanding of the ideas of act and potency. Now, we may take this for granted, but these are actually central to Thomistic philosophy. When we looked at the modernist crisis that was coming into the church, the great theologian and philosopher, Father Gary Lagrange, in order to combat the modernist errors, he appealed to the ideas of act and potency, and through these principles, he was able to defend traditional theology and philosophy from the modernists who were creeping into the church. A lot of people have also attributed most of the writings of St. Thomas in his philosophy and much of his theology to act and potency, or we could say the fundamental ideas, and in the very basic sense, all comes down to act and potency. So if we're going to have a vast understanding of theology, it is vital that we first comprehend these very fundamental ideas. Alright, so we have a basic understanding of act and potency. Now we're going to tackle another question that Parmenides and Heraclitus were looking at. And this is the idea of static versus change. Now, in order to have change, you have to have two principles. You have to have something that changes and another thing that remains the same. For if something is just simply destroyed, you don't have change. You simply have annihilation. So, in order to understand this, we will appeal to what's called the 10 categories. The 10 categories are 10 categories proposed by Aristotle that completely encompasses an explanation of material objects. So, the first of these is what's called the substance. Now, substance is very important. Substance is the very thing itself. So let's take, for example, copper. Copper is a certain type of thing. We can see many instances of copper, but we all see that even though it's not the same particular thing, they all share in the same type of thing. And that thing is substance. Next, we have accidents. Now, accidents are really part of the substance. Now, an accident is something that can be said of a substance, or we can say predicated of a substance. So we have copper, right? Copper has certain qualities and attributes. So, for example, copper has usually a certain copper color. It is shiny. It has a certain hardness. And under certain conditions, it can change. It has a potency. When copper is in the right conditions, it can turn green. It can turn into a gas, or a liquid, or a solid. Now, what is remaining in all these, the principle of stasis, is substance. The substance does not change among all these. However, the accident's quantity or quality, those things are the things that change. So we can see that the principle of stasis is substance, or the principle of change are accidents. So each substance is in potency to many types of accidents. This is why I can take a piece of gold and shape it and form a statue. Now, even though in a sense that statue is a new thing, insofar as it has a new accidental shape to it, it's still the same thing insofar as it is the same substance that was there throughout the accidental transformation. Now, there is also substantial transformation. This would be, for example, oxygen and hydrogen that transform into a new type of thing called water. Now, that's a bit more complicated, and we will be going over that next week. However, for now, we will be looking at some practical explanations of act and potency. So we learned all this, and it's interesting, but a lot of people want to know, how is this going to apply to me? How am I going to use this? Well, there are several ways where we can look at active potency and apply it to our daily lives. So one problem that a lot of us might have to face one day is the question of organ donation. Can I give someone's organs, and is it moral? Is it within the scope of Catholic moral theology? And one question that has to be asked is this idea of brain dead. Is brain dead a proper theological understanding of the human person? Now, brain dead works more or less by saying that this person who has lost their intellectual abilities is no longer fully human in some sense. We can say because they have lost these intellectual abilities, they can now be harvested for their organs. For there are certain organs such as the heart where you need to start harvesting the organs while the person is still alive. Now, one of the errors that attribute to this would be Plato. Plato believed that in each person there are three types of souls. There is the vegetative soul, the plant soul, the animal soul, the sensible soul, and there's a human soul, which is intelligent. Now, this was condemned by the Catholic Church and is also spoken against in the writings of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, if we take the Platonic idea we are reduced to through brain death, we have reduced someone to a mere plant. However, the Aristotelian idea or Thomistic concept has a very different understanding of a brain dead person. For in the case of brain dead, a person still has a first potency. What exactly does this mean? So in a normal case, a first person can actually do intellectual operations. Now he might, even when he's not doing that, maybe he's sleeping or something, he still has the second potency to perform those intellectual operations. For man needs the brain to work those intellectual operations. Now, in the case of someone who is brain dead, maybe the brain is not operating correctly. Man does not have the second potency to perform intellectual operations. And this is why some people say that this gives us the right to kill man, because he's no longer fully human. However, that's not true. That human is still more than a plant, and he's still more than an animal because of potency. That human still has the first potency for intellectual operations. A plant and an animal can never perform the intellectual operations such as love and to truly know someone through the intellect. Therefore, that human soul is still elevated far above a plant or an animal. It is something beyond that because intrinsically it is superior. The same idea can be applied to abortion. Now, there was a theory from certain evolutionary biologists that claim that within the time that a baby is being developed, they overgo the previous stages of evolution, such as being a fish and lower beings, and eventually end up as a human embryo. Now, there have been studies who have very closely looked at these theories, such as the idea that humans have gill slits when they are embryos, and this has been proven to be completely false. Now, taking this theory, or the theory of Plato, that we could come to the conclusion that in the very early stages, that this is not yet a human being, because it does not have the intellectual operations, the intellectual potential. It is only once it is born and capable of knowing certain things that it really deserves those rights, that it really deserves to be called a human being. However, that baby, just like a retarded person who may not be showing and manifesting their intellectual capacity, still has a first potency for those intellectual capacities. Therefore, those who say that the baby is just a plant or an animal is completely wrong, because he has a first potency that cannot be found in any plant, animal, or even a chimp. Now, another way we can explain potency or find its usefulness is by understanding the priesthood. Now, a lot of people know the difference between Catholics and Protestants is an understanding of the Eucharist. Now, Martin Luther actually believed in the Eucharist. He did not believe in transubstantiation, but he believed in something almost the same thing called consubstantiation. He believed that the bread and the body and wine and blood were both present, whereas Catholics believe bread and wine cease to exist, and all that remains is the body and blood of Christ. In short, Luther did truly believe that Jesus Christ was physically present in the Eucharist. There are also other Protestants who hold to they call spiritual communion. They take the scripture very seriously where it says, "Unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you shall not have eternal life." So they propose this idea that the Eucharist, that the communion or their bread and wine in their service becomes spiritually the body and blood of Christ. Now, most of them are not able to really articulate what this means because most Protestants don't have a very strong philosophical foundation. But they at least believe that this bread and wine is holy and elevated above all other bread and wine in some special way. Now, the problems that the Protestants have is their understanding of the priesthood. Even if they believe in this quasi-understanding of the Eucharist, because they don't have priests with the power to transform bread and wine into the body and blood, they don't have valid Eucharist. So what is a priest? What makes him different? When the priest becomes ordained, there's actually an ontological change. The priest receives a new potency. This potency is the power to transform the body and blood, the bread and wine, into the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, there are other types of changes, such as a relational change. Let's say some people decide I am a king. Now, my kingship is not intrinsic, but it's imposed on me by others. Other people recognize this, but there's not an intrinsic change. During the ordination of a priest, there is an intrinsic ontological potency that is actualized. And that priest now has the intrinsic power to change the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Now, another example of potency and why it is important is because this is the argument by which Aristotle and St. Thomas were able to show that motion necessitates the existence of a God. Now, most people misunderstand this argument. Here's a short analysis of how it works. So, Aristotle notices that all things that move are moved by something else. Or we could put this another way. Things that are in potency can only be actualized by something that is inert. So if a rock is not moving, it can only be moved by another thing that has actuality, that has actual movement, or potential for movement. Now, what we need to solve for is what is the first object of motion. Now, when Aristotle tries to discover the first principle of motion, he's not looking for the first object of all motion. For Aristotle believed that the universe was eternal. St. Thomas also said that though we know from Revelation that this is not so, it is not unreasonable to believe this. So Aristotle's first motion was not the first motion, but the first motion in a chain of motion. An example, in a chain of gears, you have to have what's called the principle or first cause of that chain of gears, which would be a motor. Also, in all motion, there is a first cause. Now, this first cause has to be, since it's the first, it can't be caused, but the ability to cause motion in others. Now, this cause that is not caused, but has the potential to cause motion in others, will ultimately be God. Now, this argument in of itself was critiqued by Duns Scotus and Cajetan. However, as we dig deeper into philosophy, we will unlock the principles that allow us to fully explain this argument. Well, that ends the class for today. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comment box below. If you started this talk at 12 o'clock on Sunday, there will be a code in the comment box, and you're welcome to join for a Skype session. Have a nice day.